Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of Azure Cloud Talk. I'm your host, Alec Harrison, here with co-host Brian and special guest Troy Hite, Senior Azure Technical Specialist, focused in infra. How's it going?
Good. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So I think everybody always loves to ask, how did you get to Microsoft? What's the secrets to get in there? But you want to give us a little bit of background of how did you get into tech? How did you even start your career journey, which ultimately ended up at Microsoft?
Yeah. So I feel like I kind of have maybe a slightly different trajectory than most. So I watched your last episode and kind of a similar story to Chris, I think was his name.
Mm-hmm.
But so I grew up in South Dakota on a small farm in the middle of nowhere. And from a very young age, I can remember getting our very first PC and I want to say it was 94, maybe 95. It was like a CyberMax something or other and it had like a 233 megahertz processor. And from then on, I started always tinkering with the hardware and the components, and that just kind of evolved over time. And eventually, once I moved into like middle school, high school, we were the first people in our town to actually get dial-up internet. And it was supposed to be 6K, but we actually can only get about 28.8 out of the modem on our farm. So it's aging me a little bit saying all this stuff. But once I moved into like middle school and high school, a group of my friends, we started our own LAN party organization where we would run events out of a slightly larger town that was about an hour away, where we would get all the like-minded individuals together and we would, link up all our PCs and play Counter-Strike and Quake 2 and all those old school games. And so we did that. And that actually, I was kind of in charge of the organization part of that, where I would actually cold email companies like Razer. Like now Razer is pretty well known in the gaming industry, like for keyboards and mice and all that stuff. But I would just cold email all these companies as a kid asking like, hey, could you donate like some like hardware or some swag or something that we can give away as prizes at these events? And surprisingly, a lot of organizations did. We would give away awesome like mice and headphones for the time, I guess. So that was always interesting. And then from out of high school, I went to Dakota State University in Madison, South Dakota, which is a big tech school. It's known even now, it's even more so. A lot of NSA cybersecurity efforts at Dakota State. And I started off as a computer science major and quickly realized how much math was involved in computer science and realized, I don't know if I want to do that. And so I pivoted and I went down the graphic design, multimedia web development route. And that's kind of where I ended at DSU. And so out of school, I was doing graphic design work for like printing presses. I did a lot of like band posters and CD art and a bunch of stuff. So I actually started in graphic design in my, I guess, professional career and was doing that for quite a while. I moved up to the Twin Cities in Minneapolis when I met my now wife and was, again, just doing graphic design work. And out of nowhere, one of my college buddies that moved down to Denver after he graduated, he was working in tech. He was like a manager for like sysadmins or like help desk, I want to say. And so he's like, well, we had someone quit. We're looking to fill this role. I know you're great with tech. He's like, you do absolutely great in it. And I thought, what the heck? Let's get out of graphic design and move into something a little more, more future proof. Mm-hmm. And so we moved down to Denver and I started off, I guess, my career in tech as just a help desk guy, right? Just a tier one, and then slowly worked my way up. And then from there, kind of researching and seeing how the industry works, it seems best to, you can only get so high in most organizations in a certain amount of time. And so I kind of took it upon myself to every 2 to 3 years, I would look for a new role that had different challenges and get out of my comfort zone a little bit. So I went from help desk to a sysadmin role at an MSP. And that really, I feel like, got the wheels turning, learning on handling a bunch of different clients and customers and across various technologies. Most of it was in the healthcare space. So working for little clinics and physicians' offices, doing all of their tech work. And so I learned a lot there and transitioned so this was all while I was in Denver. And we lived out in Denver for, I want to say 7 years, and transitioned to a couple different roles. And then we had our son out in Denver, but we didn't have any family out in Denver. So we realized, it'd probably be better to let's move back closer to family so we can grow up with all the cousins and, all the family upbringing that we had growing up in the Midwest. And so we moved back to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I got a job at Mid-Continent Communications, also known as Midco. They're the largest internet service provider for like North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and a little bit in Kansas now, where I was a quote unquote server administrator, a Windows server administrator. So essentially I was in charge of all the Windows environments in the data centers. So I was racking and stacking hardware, servers, new storage solutions, NetApps. And I really, really enjoyed that kind of work. And so from there, we realized I worked there for 3 years and loved the work. And we then realized that maybe we were a little too close to family. And so we moved back to the Twin Cities. So we did like this kind of whole loop from Minnesota to Denver, back to Sioux Falls, and then back to Minneapolis. So we moved back up to Minneapolis. I took a job with the state of Minnesota, working for the IT agency for the state's called Minute, or Minnesota IT Services, where that's when I actually really started getting into cloud, because I started work at the Department of Health, and they are primarily an AWS shop. And at the time, that was kind of my first real introduction to I shouldn't say first introduction, but first real world introduction to cloud. I'd always been messing around in both AWS and Azure, a little bit in GCP, but real like first, hands-on practical work doing day to day. And it was mostly DevOps related work. So I've kind of always shifted and not tried to pigeonhole myself into like one area in tech. I try to keep the solution area broad, because I feel like you're always more versatile if you don't try and pigeonhole yourself to, I only do infra, or I only do DevOps, or I only do this, right? You need kind of that holistic approach. But so working at the state of Minnesota, I started there in late 2019. So if you think of the timeline, late 2019, before the pandemic, I started working for the Department of Health. So you can imagine, once the pandemic and lockdown kicked off, how busy our teams at MDH were, both on the business side, like the actual MDH folks, but also us supporting all of the systems to facilitate all of the like contact tracing and all the information that was flowing in from the federal government. And it was a very interesting time to work for the Department of Health. So,
and basically on a dime drop, I'm assuming making it so people could work from home, because they probably weren't doing that, at least not to the extent.
No, we were all in office every day, right? And so it was a big shift. I mean, for the tech side of the house, for Minute's side, it didn't really matter. I mean, all of us were really working remote in the office anyway. We're all sitting on Teams calls at a desk. We're all administering systems that are not at our desk; they're somewhere else. So, for us, it wasn't a shift, but for the business folk, I'll say, that was facilitating all that was challenging. But during that whole process, it came to light that, hey, this guy Troy, he's got experience at working in Azure. Because I did have a little experience on the Midco side prior to working at the state, starting some of their work in Azure, getting landing zones set up, and really they were just kind of starting their Azure journey. But at the time at the state of Minnesota, no one had that familiarity, even at a minuscule level. So another agency at the state, the Department of Labor and Industry, was building one of their big applications completely in Azure. And so they needed someone to come in and like, hey, is this right? Are we doing things right? You have some experience. Why don't you help drive this? And so that ended up being over half of my day, as was developing this completely cloud first Azure application, a very large application in Azure. And ironically enough, always keeping my ears to the ground and my feelers open on LinkedIn and other sources, I was working obviously with Microsoft folks from the other side while we were building out this application for DLI. And I actually just got hit up by a Microsoft recruiter saying, hey, we see you have experience. Would you be interested in interviewing at Microsoft? And I said, I guess if Microsoft knocks, you kind of have to answer the door, right? So I kind of went through the whole process and ultimately got the job as a cloud solution architect. And so that is really kind of the roundabout way of how I got into tech and how I ultimately landed at Microsoft. So kind of a semi non-traditional path than most, going into a non-tech, sort of tech, graphic design, multimedia web development, but it wasn't like a computer science. I never have called myself a developer. I am dangerous, but I'm not a developer. But Yeah.
It's awesome. That's a roundabout way to get there. I think you're the second, maybe. I don't remember the other person if they were a CSA. They were focusing more in the AI space at Microsoft. Can you make the distinction? Like you were a CSA, now you're a technical specialist. Are those the same role? Like what does a day to day look like? And how did the role change when you went from, tech specialist to CSA or I mean vice versa?
Right, right. No, it's interesting, and I'm going on my third year now at Microsoft, and so I'll still call myself relatively new. But upon starting, it was really drinking from a fire hose. Like I've always thought that saying was cliche and whatnot, but it was overwhelming to say the least. Like I had never worked at such a massive organization before, and so coming in, I was a cloud solution architect, and I won't get into the nitty gritty on how Microsoft like assigns and is organized internally. But essentially, you usually get assigned a series of clients in a certain vertical space, whether that's health and human services or, software development vertical, manufacturing vertical, or just a region. And so I'm in what we call the West Midwest region. And so that covers customers all the way from California across basically the whole United States with some caveats in different sections, right? But so I was assigned as a pinned cloud solution architect to the Accenture account. Now, Accenture is a very massive organization, another one that rivals Microsoft in sheer employee size and global footprint. So essentially, I was drinking from two fire hoses when I started because I had to learn and understand the Accenture side of the house and how they operated, what they're doing in Azure, and then also navigating Microsoft and what that looks like. So from a day-to-day role responsibility, I mean, a cloud solution architect is if you look at it in terms of a sales cycle, right? So if you start at the very beginning where you have some of your specialists that are driving sales, working with customers because they want to do something, and then they go, okay, yep, we're going to do that. We're committed to doing that. And once it gets past that stage, that's when a cloud solution architect usually comes in and goes, all right, I'm going to help you make this thing into production and make it a reality. And so I did that for 2 years. And this is my first full year as a technical specialist. And essentially, in not so many words, it's essentially the same role, I'll say in a lot of ways. It's just I sit more on the early side of that cycle where customer says some things like, hey, we're thinking about maybe doing this. I'm involved early on in the stage to say, yeah, this is how you should do it. This isn't how you should do it. You're not thinking the right way. You should be doing it this way. And then once we get to a point where they're like, okay, yep, this is the path we're going to take, that's when the CSA comes in and just basically finishes it. So there's a lot of CSAs that want to be TSPs, or there's a lot of TSPs that were once CSAs. I'd say the latter is more common. Most of our technical specialists were CSAs before. And it's just a matter of kind of what side of the fence you want to sit on. I find it more interesting, like talking early on and helping them kind of guide them to the right place instead of being handed and then trying to recorrect after the fact. I find that more challenging, I guess.
Did you say the technical specialist is more of an architect role?
Yeah,
kind of, and the
for
cloud
sure.
solution architect is more of the engineer role, the implementation role, or little architecture
Yes.
too?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you say that because things have kind of shifted recently at Microsoft where what you just said is more accurate than maybe in previous years. So the CSA, what a lot of people internally would call the legacy CSA role, is essentially an architect, maybe a little engineer, and also does some pre-sale type work as well, like a TSP type role. But now, two fiscal years ago now at Microsoft, they kind of made a direct delineation of CSAs are now kind of more on the engineering side, repeatable delivery, workshop engagements, that track against specific unified support hours. And then the TSP, the technical specialist role, will handle all the pre-sale type activity, architecting, that kind of stuff, right? More free-form, helping and working with the customer to architect the right solution, not just a solution, but the right solution. Yeah.
So I kind of have two questions. So would it be fair to say that TSP or technical specialist is more like hey, I have a problem. So you're like boiling the ocean to like get a rough roadmap or a rough like, hey, here's the loose plan that we think and services you'll probably use. And then you give a rough ballpark plan to the cloud solution architect, and then they help them actually implement the you're going to write up and be like, hey, you need an app service, or hey, you need Azure Functions, or hey, you need Azure Container Apps. You need you basically take the big breadth thing, start to boil it down of this service will live here, this will live here, this will live here for your use case, and then you kind of hand off the roadmap. Is that kind of the delineation now?
I mean, at a high level, kind of. So it's important to note that we also kind of break things up based on solution area. So I'm an infrastructure focused technical specialist. So I help customers with anything from, their basic compute, networking, storage, governance, policy, monitoring, that kind of breadth. And AI. Obviously, AI is the buzzword of the decade, probably. But there's a lot of bleed over. And so I'm in the infrastructure space. There's also what we have an application innovation space, where think of that as more like developer, like application specific. So if there's a team of developers that are trying to do something very specific, we would engage, my counterpart on the app innovation side. And there's also data and AI. So those are kind of the three main solution areas, but there's always bleed in all of those because there's always an infrastructure component to an AI application. There's always an infrastructure component to, a large scale application deployment, actually spinning up the app services, configuring the networking. So there's a lot of bleed, and that's kind of, I feel like one of my areas of expertise is I have familiarity in the app innovation space coming from working on DevOps teams. And so I'm very familiar with working with GitHub and GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps and pipelines. And then on the AI side, I heavily work with a lot of those data and AI specialists as customers are building out their AI apps. Most of the AI folks at Microsoft, they don't know anything about networking. So anytime those kind of things come up, all right, well, I'll come in and I'll tell you how to do all this. And so there's a big theme at Microsoft called One Microsoft that we all try to work together. And it is really true. Now, I've heard that same kind of saying said in a roundabout way, a lot of different organizations, but the culture at Microsoft actually really does live by that. And it's kind of refreshing, honestly, to see it in action.
Nice.
That makes sense. Right. Are both of those roles then pre-sales, or if I'm at an organization and I just liked the description you gave, but maybe I don't have a CSA or I don't have a technical specialist, how do I get somebody like that?
So now we're navigating into the nuances of account management at Microsoft. And I'm only 3 years in from my experience. So you're sort of right. The technical specialist is technically a pre-sales role, right? So we are in the sales organization and we are tied to a seller that covers a specific number of accounts as part of our region, and how they break all that up. I have no idea how someone way smarter than me figures all that out at Microsoft. But so I basically work in pair with a seller, or we call it a specialist, that works with the customers. And I'm basically there, kind of like what we already talked about, helping them go in the right direction. But I'm also kind of keeping my specialist, my seller, honest on the way things are being pitched back to the customer, right? From a technical perspective, I'm kind of his what's the word I want to use? Beacon of truth. Yes, this will actually do that. We got to think about this and this, right? So we are technically in the sales organization, whereas a CSA or a cloud solution architect is in what we call the customer success organization. And so they, again, take it after the customer's already committed to it and then help it move into production. And so from a CSA perspective and how you could reach out as an organization could reach out, it's all going to depend on kind of your volume of business with Microsoft. And so typically for an organization to be able to use CSA or to have it at their disposal, it's changed recently. It used to be if you're part of this region or this vertical, you probably have a CSA at your disposal. Now CSAs are directly tied to unified support contracts. So if your organization doesn't have unified support, you won't typically, I'm not saying always, but you won't typically have a CSA kind of at your disposal. And so that's usually the driver. And I don't know if you know anything about unified support at Microsoft, but it's spendy, to say the least. Cool. So that could be a deterrent for maybe some smaller organizations, right? Sure. But that's something that's relatively new, and it's ever changing too. I could definitely see that switching back. Microsoft does a lot of changes every fiscal year where they see what's working, what's not working, and then they flip it on its head. So every year it's okay, what's going on now? All right, try to learn it all.
That makes sense. I've seen wider MSPs, they're maybe the ones fronting the bill for unified support, and then a bunch of other people pay them and they're like the middleman of support, and they can escalate to Microsoft, but then everybody kind of wins, right? Because they're splitting the cost of unified support across multiple clients, and then those multiple clients aren't paying the big bill of one unified support contract. So I think that that makes a lot of sense as far as the way you described it and why what I've seen in practice with organizations. Yeah. But
All right. I
right.
have a couple of questions that I think are going to be really interesting now that we have
boy.
you here.
Boy.
So you mentioned earlier a word that has haunted me since I first heard it. And it is, well, it's not, it's actually two words, landing zones. So when I hear landing zones, my first thought is, oh, there must be something that I can just push a button and get this nice little thing that has all the things I need in it. So from what I understand, that's not the case with landing zones, but can you just explain what a landing zone is? And if I'm a new customer and I'm going to be doing, I'm assuming a scenario you would want, and correct me if I'm wrong here, for a landing zone, you don't technically need that if you're only going to do like a one and done deployment. It's more like we have 6 different regional things or whatever we want to do, but they all need to be kind of the same. Right. So yeah, so can you kind of just explain from the ground up for like the person who doesn't even maybe even heard of landing zone, what's involved in that and how it's not just a push button thing that's pre-configured, right?
You're mostly right.
Okay.
So we do have, to that point, there are such things as landing zone accelerators based on, like there's a one that I just actually helped a customer deploy, which is it's like an AI chatbot landing zone accelerator, which is, okay, I won't say a single button click and you're done, but it's a pre-configured Azure environment that has all of the, I'll call it the plumbing already pre-configured, all of the virtual networking already all configured, and it'll deploy all the resources with all the necessary RBAC roles and permissions and deploy an application into it. So in that sense, there are things like that out there. There are what we call landing zone accelerators. It's not and it's never anything that I would ever recommend a customer doing in production. It's more to get your hands dirty quicker and, speed up that barrier to entry. But overall, when I have landing zone discussions with my customers, I basically talk about how it's setting up an Azure environment per Microsoft best practices. Now, there is no, and maybe some other people at Microsoft will disagree with me, but there is no one landing zone that'll work for every customer. Everything needs to be customized based on business requirements, what they're actually planning to do in Azure. It all needs to be thought through and talked through to make sure you're setting it up right. Now, that term does get thrown around a lot, kind of loosely, and it doesn't really mean a whole lot. So I totally get what you're saying. But when I approach those discussions, I really try to zoom it out. And typically, most of the customers that I work with already are in Azure. They're already familiar. A lot of the small organizations or organizations that are just getting into Azure, I feel like that's more of a place to talk about landing zones and on having people understand them, because you want to get in and do things right at the beginning instead of trying to reel everything back after everything's deployed. And really, that's what it's doing. I mean, you're setting up the environment per Microsoft best practices, how you should structure and organize your resources, and how you should configure networking and some of the basic shared services that all Azure resources use to do it in the most efficient way possible. Now, that'll vary per every organization. I've never seen the same landing zone architecture for any one or for more than one customer. Like, I've never seen 2 of the same. Because it's always something that should be customized. It should fit how they work day in and day out. Like, how do your operations teams do X, Y, and Z? There's a lot that goes into those discussions. But you're right. It's a term, even kind of within Microsoft, that gets thrown around loosely. Oh, it's just a landing zone. Do they have a landing zone? Well, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean? Yeah, they have an Azure environment. They have places for these resources. That works for them. That's a landing zone. Sure. It's a place where resources can be deployed. But the broad landing zone term is really just a way for us as Microsoft to say, this is how you should be doing it, not how you have to do it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so you're saying if I deployed something to Azure, I've already got a landing zone, but it's probably not what I would want to call a landing zone. It's more of an environment I've deployed. But with a real one, you're going to have things like networking, governance, policies, all the things in it. And that's where you're going to vary across organizations. And then the idea being, okay, so now I'm just a small shop. Before I deploy anything, I create the correct Azure environment and call that my landing zone.
Right. Right.
Okay. And then I can repeat that for dev and prod and stuff.
Yes. Well, yeah, that all goes into that discussion too, like having multiple environments that are as close to the same as possible, right? Might not always work out 100% in reality, but and having it be repeatable too. So it's another thing we always stress about deploying everything as code whenever possible. I know that's easier said than done, especially for a lot of smaller organizations, but it's something that I've seen work in production incredibly well. And it's saved a lot of customers a lot of heartache down the road when they can go, I can just redeploy this. Or it enables that self-provisioning mindset where you're not restricted necessarily to operations folks. If you get to a point where you can self-provision things, you can say, here's a Terraform template that'll deploy X application into Azure, run this, we'll let you do that. And if it messes up, we can spin it up again, right? But really, the landing zone is exactly what you said. But then I'll also say that, thinking through governance and organization of resources. How are you going to organize your subscriptions? How and where are you going to implement Azure policy as to what scope? Which management group are you, thinking through all of those different things and laying them out per Microsoft best practices. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that definitely clears it up. I really appreciate that because it's such a mystery. And then you see like, hey, we're just going to have a landing zone for it. I'm like, okay, great.
What does that mean?
Right. Define landing zone. Well, it's a place where I put my stuff. Okay.
Well, that's
good.
not wrong, but
right.
Not the whole picture.
Yeah. Okay. I have another technical question for you.
Oh boy.
This is another one that has been a point of, I'm not really sure how to say this without implicating myself. How about I just ask the question and you can respond to the question. So service endpoints in the network versus private endpoints in the network. So with my networking, let's say that I want to do a very simple VNet and I want to have a storage account or a database. And from my understanding, if I want to have the network connection, I can use either a service endpoint or a private endpoint. The question I have is there one that's better for keeping my traffic guaranteed to be private?
Yes.
Okay. And the second part of that question is, which one would I use if I want granular control over
Private
resources?
endpoint.
Okay.
Private
Yeah.
endpoint.
Okay, cool. Okay. So
For
which
both.
one's better for both?
Yes.
Okay. So service endpoints. So am I correct if I say service endpoint traffic does go over the public backbone? So or does it still stay in Microsoft, but it's just not private? How does that work?
Stays on the Microsoft backbone, but I guess it depends on what your definition of private means.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's on the Microsoft backbone, but it's traversing Microsoft's global backbone, right?
Okay.
So, and I've actually run into this exact same question recently with a customer because they had a unique situation where they're an organization, they have a storage account, they have a third-party vendor that needs to have access to pull data from the storage account. How do we facilitate that? And I was like, well, there's a lot of different ways we could do it. How are you doing it now? What are the problems you're having? And ultimately, what they were having an issue that they were trying to restrict the traffic to their storage account. They had a security policy that said, hey, I can have no public facing storage accounts.
Right.
And we need to explicitly allow and deny traffic to the storage account using the storage account firewall. And it's like, okay, yeah, I'm tracking what you're saying. It seems like this should be easy. Well, when you have two different customers that are both in Azure, like let's say the storage account for this organization, my customer was obviously in Azure. This third party, we don't know where they're at. Well, they happen to also be in Azure. This application lives in Azure, different tenant, different subscription, and they were running into issues because they couldn't allow the traffic from their environment because they had a service endpoint enabled for that application in that subnet where the application lived for storage. So when that application was trying to reach out to the other storage account in my customer's tenant, it was using the service endpoint IP space, which is like a Microsoft internal, and you can't, on a storage account firewall, allow that IP space. And so ultimately we had to go back to the third party and say, well, this would absolutely work the way you have it. You have to disable the service endpoint in the subnet where this application lives. So it's still private. It's not traversing the public internet, but it's traversing the Microsoft global backbone.
Right.
But for full granularity of control, I would say use private endpoints.
Yeah.
And especially depends on also where is the network connectivity originating from and going to? Or do we have some on-premise or third party, like an express route or site-to-site VPN, just traffic need to flow that way? Then I would have to use private endpoints, right? So it all kind of depends, but I would say in general, private endpoints are the way to go. Now, that being said, it does add an extra layer of complexity to your architecture and environment.
Absolutely. You got to have the DNS zone set up so that the traffic's routed. So we ran into a scenario at a client I was working with one time where we did leverage the private endpoints. It was coming from an on-prem scenario back into the Azure scenario, and we were debating where the error was in the routing because the traffic from their side coming into the Azure side at some point was not able to be routed to our account or storage account or database, whatever it was. I can't remember exactly. But what it turned out is that even though whatever application they were using was using like a storage connection string to connect, and when they were running it from their side, it still wanted to go to the public storage account. So we ended up having to also add an Azure DNS forwarder into the hub so that we could then tell their side to use that as their DNS, and then it knew, it's got the private endpoint address. But the granularity of having your own unique private endpoint addresses, I found, has been ideal for not only just for not being able to route things correctly and not having any question of whether you're routing to the right place, but also just like if you have two storage accounts in the same subnet and you maybe want to block some traffic, you've got a unique IP per
exactly
account. So,
but it does add that complexity to it. And I actually have an article that I wrote in the Azure Architecture Center that kind of talks about the scenario that you were just talking about. It's basically like a split brain DNS issue, right? Because you got customers on premise, their DNS says they see private.core. whatever, and it's trying to resolve it out on the internet. Well, we don't want it to. It needs to go to this DNS zone. So you need a forwarder to go to that private DNS zone. And another thing I'll always stress when it comes to private endpoints is always, maybe I shouldn't say always, but take advantage of the private DNS zones in Azure. Don't try to roll your own DNS when it comes to private endpoints, because you can. There's absolutely a way to do it. But then you're already taking something super complex and then you're adding in another layer of complexity. I always just tell customers, let Microsoft manage it.
So you're saying there's a resource called the Azure Private DNS Zone. You're saying just use that. Don't try to roll up a Linux box with some sort of like weird application, third-party application where you're directing your traffic to and letting that do it. Okay.
Right. Yeah, because then you're adding just another point of failure into all your DNS. And if you've worked in tech long enough, you know all problems originate from DNS. So
probably the firewall.
Or the firewall. Yeah. The network guys, it's all their fault.
Yeah. Those are the two.
Those were two questions that have haunted me, because when you I trained for AZ 104 and 305, but this really comes up more in 104 when you're doing the implementation, not the theory. And so it's just like, okay, well, they both work. Like you said, like you can both do it, but like to what you're saying there, you cleared up for me, like, because I got it in my head, like I said, implicating myself a little bit, that service endpoints, although were useful, they were over the public backbone.
Right.
So I'm glad to be corrected on that and know that it is at least private. I can feel a little bit at ease knowing that some configuration I did 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago or whatever isn't maybe technically as insecure as I was secretly worried it might be.
Right. And I feel like I was just on a call the other day with someone on our product group, like one of the networking product groups, and they kind of shed light into that. I brought them in per that customer scenario I had where the two storage accounts and different tenants having the issue, and it was ultimately going over the service endpoint. And they made mention of something along the lines of like service endpoints are kind of like the legacy way in which to achieve what now would be done, typically through private endpoints or private link, depending on the service and whether it supports it. So I found that interesting. I don't take my word at that either. I don't know if it's legacy or if it's going to be going away anytime soon. No one knows that. Everything changes so much every day. But speaking about private endpoints, it's a good segue into something I'm going to be doing that's customer facing coming up here next Wednesday. And it's all around AI and configuring like true private networking for an AI workload in Azure. And so it's something, I don't know if you can share. It's like public, anyone can register and come to it. But what I
want to
found,
go.
yeah, what I found in being at different like internal Microsoft conferences and watching videos, everyone talks about the secure AI infrastructure, right? And they'll throw up an architecture on the screen as it relates to networking, and they'll be like, yep, here's all these private endpoints, it's secure. Well, yeah, I mean, that's like the 10,000 foot view of it. But when you want to get into actually deploying it and configuring it, there's a lot more nuance into configuring private connectivity to all the different Azure AI services. Like Azure OpenAI is different than Azure AI Search is different, and Azure multi-service account is different in the way in which private network connectivity is configured. And so what I'm going to do is, I felt like it was necessary to really have customers understand the reality of, okay, you want to configure a completely private AI application for your organization. Here's what you actually need to do it. I just don't like the idea of throwing up a architecture that has some private endpoints and say, yep, you're done. No, there's a lot more to it than that. So that's going to be coming up on Wednesday. I guess it'll be next Wednesday, but I'll share that with you for sure.
Will it be recorded? Like, will there be a video available of it?
If you register and are unable to attend, you will get the deck in which I'm presenting along with the recording.
Okay.
So yes.
Is that through Microsoft then? Oh, perfect. Like one of their training days?
Kind of, sort of. It's the thing that my team is putting on called Azure AI Unleashed. And it's been an ongoing series for the last few months where like every week there's been a different AI story being told, training, if you will, to walk through different components of an AI workload. And so I think this is the last one technically in the series. Yeah, it's been good. It's been well received. We've gotten a lot of customers and people on them, and we'll continue doing these. I think based off of the engagement that we've had with the series so far, I wouldn't be surprised if we kind of restart it and just keep doing it because it's been super helpful.
So another curious question to follow up with that is it always going to be just Microsoft people presenting, or would you open that up to MVPs or anybody else who would maybe want to present for part of that?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't see why not. And I know there's a big Azure MVP summit coming up at the end of this month. Are you guys going to it?
Yeah. We got the MCT summit starts on Friday next week. So this time next week, actually 17 minutes and 7 days from now, I'll be presenting at the MCT summit.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And then that's going to be a really fun 3-day weekend of MCT stuff. And then it's immediately followed up by MVP stuff. So it's going to be a great time. But yeah.
I'm actually volunteering for the MVP summit. I'm going to be in like an online moderator for a lot of the sessions. So I might. Yeah.
Nice. Are you going to be in one of the rooms?
No, unfortunately, I'm going to be remote. I was actually just out in Seattle. It's in Seattle, right?
Yeah.
I was just out in Seattle at the beginning of February. We had an internal conference, like a training type conference. So they probably won't send me back to Seattle again this month. So
you should just tell them you have to be there. Otherwise, how could you possibly moderate?
It's true.
There's some truth that you can put it on your credit card.
Yeah, right.
Probably what it would be. Yeah.
Well, make sure we get the link to that AI training because we would love to include that. And
I will absolutely put it in the description. I think I put it in the studio chat. It's on Troy's LinkedIn right now. So if you follow him or look him up, it'll also be podcast description. When we announce this on Monday, I'll put it all over too. So if you're looking to do truly secure AI in Azure, I'll make sure you check it out, and that'll be a good time. I think getting pretty close to time, but I think the $1 million question is always whenever somebody from a big tech company is around. Troy, how do you get a job at Microsoft? Do you have any, now that you're on the inside, advice, recommendations, that sort of stuff? Or how did it work for you if you can't speak like holistically or don't want to?
Well, I feel like this is a part of it for me, at least. I'm going to speak for myself. I was actually contacted by Microsoft, which isn't necessarily always the case. And so that definitely helped me. Now, in terms of other folks, what I would say is it definitely helps to network yourself. Know folks within the organization that can vouch for you. There's a very good referral program that Microsoft has. So if you know someone that works at Microsoft and you have, let's say you've gone to careers.microsoft.com, you actually found a post that is something that you're interested in, and that person that is at Microsoft knows you well enough to vouch for you, that's definitely a good way in, because then that person at Microsoft can also do some vouching potentially to the hiring manager. Again, networking is big, obviously, in any big tech company. I would also say in terms of like recommendations for like a resume or skill set, I mean, definitely being a tech enthusiast is great, but also I think a lot of people overlook soft skills a lot. That's a big thing at Microsoft, being personable. You want to be someone that is comfortable talking with customers. I mean, it depends on the role, right? Not every job is customer facing, but to be personable, and that is something that's huge. Also, it's driven home all the time, and it's very true, is you need to have a growth mindset. And it's something that is talked about almost daily at Microsoft. You have to be a motivated learner, because in this space, everything changes all the time, every day. And there's no way anyone can know it, but having the mindset that you want to learn it is very important. And stressing that in the point where if you ever get into an interview, I would say is a huge like light bulb moment for any potential hiring person. If you are dedicated to learning and continuous learning, that's a big one.
I think I've heard the phrase from other people at Microsoft, have a learn it all attitude, not a know it all attitude.
Yes.
Because you're not going to, if you try to learn all of Azure, you're going to be,
Possible.
It's a fool's errand for a single person. But if you're willing to go and learn, get your hands dirty, I've heard that advice. So Brian, I don't know if you've been taking notes, but if you decide to apply, it sounds like you could reach out to Troy.
Yeah. I don't know if he knows me well enough to vouch for me. And he also knows my secret about service endpoints. So he might say, yeah, that guy, see, that's really not a really good growth mindset, like right there.
But you wanted to learn.
I did want to learn. Yeah. I need to know. I don't even, it's more I need to know. I don't want to train people the wrong way,
Right.
That would, thinking that it's on paper, it looks like this, but.
Right. Yeah, well, and that's funny because it's, you also have to be able to fail fast at Microsoft. That's another big thing. Like I've absolutely been on calls with customers where they've asked me something and I was 100% sure I knew the answer, and I told them and I walked them down a path, and then I come to learn the next day or a week later, that wasn't true at all. But so being able to acknowledge it, go back, work with them, fix it, like it's one of those soft skills or mental kind of attitudes that not everyone has, but you're going to get things wrong and you're going to fail, but let's just do it fast so you can keep learning.
That's awesome. I think one of the biggest, so I do a lot of education stuff, and one of the biggest problems in education is the inability to fail. So you're given a test, and it's like, if you fail this test, you're done. It's like, no, that's not fair. Like, you need to be able to fail that test so you can figure out. That's why I think I love the certification program from Microsoft so much, because I could fail over and over again. Don't ask me about my AZ700 results. So anyway.
Well, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with certifications. Definitely, I've taken all sorts of technical certifications over the years. I think I hold like 12 Microsoft certifications right now, in Azure just specifically. And what I will say is they are a good litmus test of overall knowledge, but that can never be used as an excuse to justify experience. Does that make sense? Yeah, you pass a test, and you might have the knowledge, but have you actually helped someone implement it? Have you actually gotten your hands dirty? Do you have like real world experience? Yeah. So I feel like it's part of, it's a necessary evil, if you will, in our industry. Like, you need to have some of these certifications. I have to. Like, I'm obligated in my role. I have to have these certifications, but I just kind of have that love-hate relationship. But I do think Microsoft certifications across all the ones I've taken, whether it's NetApp or Citrix or VMware, are by and far the I won't say the best, but they are way better than everyone else, because I love the switch to the online renewals.
Absolutely. That was a game changer.
That was just perfect, because
rather than retire and have to retake.
Exactly. And it's like, and it then forces you once a year. They can, okay, what changed in this year? Here's what changed. You open book, take it at your own time for free, and then you're good. Right. And it's on you to renew within time. I've actually had one expire like the day after I checked, and it expired the day before I checked. And I was like, all right,
that's the worst.
That's on me.
You had 6 months, man.
I know I did it 6 months and I didn't do it, but it's such a way better system now for sure.
I agree. I think a lot of us have talked about this too offline, and just like what you said there is the most, I think the most important part of that is what's changed between the time I took the exam and what I need to know now. Like the learn path gives you the stuff you need to know to renew, and you can see kind of what you, and it does make sure that you have kept on top of your game. And I really appreciate that about it.
Mm-hmm. You know, and the other big one too, that's more recent, was the ability to utilize the Microsoft Learn platform during a certification exam, which I think is another addition to realizing how people actually work in the real world. Like,
absolutely,
you're going to have documentation available. You're not going to necessarily know everything. So,
well, and it's always questions like, okay, so which Azure VPN gateway should I deploy in order to get 60,000 IOPS per minute, or some ridiculous question like that nobody memorizes.
Right.
And I mean, I'm not saying that's a question on any exam by any means. I would never, ever talk about a question. I'm just saying, like, potentially some random question like that that's very technically inclined that you could look up in the real world. Now you can, if that showed up on your exam or if something similar showed up. So yeah, it's a really great ad in my mind to kind of ease your mind. You don't have to sit here and try to memorize everything.
Right.
And then only remember it for that test.
Right. And then it just goes away and you don't ever think about it again. But I think it just shows how Microsoft is trying to kind of meet the industry where it's at. Like it's more real world, I feel like, and a better, they're trying to close the gap between that, like, do you just know all this and you memorized it versus this is how you'd kind of operate in the real world. They're trying to kind of bring that down.
Sure. I think it's all awesome stuff. Troy, do you have any last minute plugs, or if people want to follow along with you, how would they do that?
So I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. It's the one job I've ever had that actually promotes employees to use social media. Obviously, it's because Microsoft owns LinkedIn, but so I'm the most active there. And outside of the kind of AI Unleashed series I talked about, that event that's coming up, there's also a lot of, and I can share those directly with you, Alec, a lot of like customer facing workshops that customers can sign on and sign up for that maybe not everyone's aware of. So I could kind of spread some awareness around some of those events that are coming up in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, for sure. That'd be awesome. Thanks for joining us. It was awesome to meet you, and we'll see everybody again next week.
Likewise.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good one, guys.
You too. Thanks.